Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Fulham, as Chris introduced, and I'm the Standards Coordinator with the New Mexico Environment Department Surface Water Quality Bureau. So we're here today to provide you with some updates and information pertaining to the state's triennial review of standards for interstate and intrastate surface waters. Before we begin, though, I just want to thank everybody for coming today and taking the time out to participate in this discussion. And in order to facilitate our discussion, we're going to have 4 key areas that we want to explore with you. The first is the general framework that regulates the process for a triennial review of water quality standards. Next, we're going to discuss the amendments that the Bureau is considering for this triennial review. Then we'll go through the general administrative process and the tentative timelines to meet those critical milestones. And then finally, we're interested in hearing from you, the public, on areas of the water quality standards that you may have questions on areas for us to consider for amendment. So to begin, we're going to start off with a regulatory framework for water quality standards. So what's a triennial review? In short, it's a review of the state's water quality standards, and it's called a triennial because it's supposed to occur at least once every 3 years. There are more details on what's reviewed and the process to conduct a triennial review, including holding a hearing, which we'll discuss a little bit later on in the presentation. But to start off, we want to provide some high-level basic regulatory background that sets us reasoning. So this slide highlights the 3 areas of the Clean Water Act and the regulations that pertain specifically to the triennial review. The first is under Section 303C of the Federal Pollution Control Act, or is commonly referred to the Clean Water Act. Then, under the regulations for environmental protection, specifically 40 CFR 131.20, and finally, we find regulatory language requiring a triennial review under Section 20.6.4.10a of the state's administrative code, or as we abbreviate it, NMAC. So now that we have the underlying foundation set up in the regulations, let's explore what standards are and how they're developed. So from the general citations presented in the previous slide, we can break this down further so you can see some of the basic regulatory background that drives the water quality standard development. Overarching is the Federal Clean Water Act. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Would folks mind muting? I'm going to try and continue. Okay. So the Clean Water Act is with the objective to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. The Clean Water Act is implemented through federal regulation. So as you see in the second box under 40 CFR, states are required to hold a hearing on their water quality standards no less than every 3 years. And this is for the purpose of reviewing designated uses, the anti-degradation policy, temporary standards, as well as the other implementation policies in the standards. So as you'll see, this requirement really ends up being the guiding language as we proceed through the triennial review. In order to meet the requirements set forth in the federal act and regulations, the state set up the Water Quality Act. And as part of the act, they designated the Water Quality Control Commission. Water Quality Control Commission, or as we refer to it as the WQCC, has been delegated duties and powers, which include the adoption of water quality standards in accordance with the Clean Water Act. Those standards are then codified under NMAC under 20.6.4. It should be mentioned here that New Mexico has the authority and has developed water quality standards under 20.6.4 NMAC, not only for the nation's waters, but for waters of the state, which are defined under NMAC and include a broader spectrum of waters, including wetlands. So as we illustrate here, the state's water quality standards serve to meet both state and federal acts to uphold the objectives of the Clean Water Act. Because these standards are codified under rule, any amendment to these standards must undergo a rulemaking process. And there are numerous other state and federal regulations that guide this process, But one of the predominant requirements for making is conducting a public hearing. So as this pertains to the triennial review, the New Mexico Environment Department, being the technical support for the Water Quality Control Commission, is the lead entity to ensure a triennial review is conducted every 3 years. So what is a water quality standard anyways, and what is the process for determining if an amendment is needed? In order to better understand water quality standards, I'm going to take a minute and walk you through the elements of one. As depicted here on this slide, a water quality standard as defined by EPA includes 3 elements: a designated use for a water body, the criteria that are required to support that use, and an anti-degradation policy. And as we just explained, the state's water quality standards are codified under 20.6.4 NMAC. And as many of you may know, there are other portions of NMAC that are outside of these 3 elements. And although they're technically not a standard, they are regulations that describe the process to uphold the state's Water Quality Act and the Federal Clean Water Act, and are included in the triennial review. So I'll be going through each of these elements to give you a little bit more background on what they are and how they're reviewed as part of the triennial review process. So the first element of a water quality standard is the anti-degradation policy. This policy is fairly straightforward and lays out the protections for ensuring degradation of waters does not occur. In New Mexico, we have 3 tiers of protections, all of which prevent degradation of water quality in waters of the state. The most restrictive of protections are those designated as outstanding national resource waters, or as we call them, ONRWs. Activities that may affect water quality in these waters is not prohibited, but it has to be demonstrated that it would not cause degradation before being permitted. The second tier of protection under the anti-degradation policy is for those waters that are exceeding the highest possible designated use. And then at a minimum, and applicable for all waters of the state, the anti-degradation policy protects for the existing uses. Existing uses are those uses that are actually attained anytime after November 28, 1975, even if they're not the designated use or they're not currently being attained. So remember, the goal of the Clean Water Act is to maintain and protect the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So the anti-degradation policy ensures actions are being taken towards that objective by continually improving water quality. Because the anti-degradation policy is an element of a water quality standard, it's codified under 20.6.4 NMAC. However, the implementation plan for the policy is actually approved and adopted by the Water Quality Control Commission and EPA Region 6 as part of the state's Water Quality Management Plan and Continuing Planning process. And amendments to the implementation plan are therefore done independently of the triennial review. But as general practice, the anti-degradation policy under 20.6.4 NMAC is only reviewed during the triennial review, and if warranted, amended as appropriate. So moving on to the second element of water quality standards, which are designated uses. Designated uses can be thought of as goals for a water body. They are the highest uses to which the water body should be able to support. And as part of meeting the objective of the Water Quality Act, the state has established 2 subcategories of recreational uses and 7 subcategories for aquatic life uses. In addition, the state also has designated uses for wildlife habitat, livestock watering, domestic water supply, irrigation, and fish culture. In New Mexico, all waters of the state at a minimum have a designated use to protect for wildlife habitat, a recreational use, and at least 1 subcategory of aquatic life uses. So amending a designated use is the predominant type of amendment that we see in the state's water quality standards. And generally, it's the most involved type of amendment as far as processes go. And here's why. When a water body is identified to need a designated use review, a comprehensive evaluation is initiated through the development of a work plan. The work plan's intent is to evaluate whether there's sufficient evidence available to support an analysis, including the necessary data that would be needed to support that analysis. And it's conducted whether a water body is believed to be overprotective or underprotected. So it's important to keep in mind, not all work plans lead to an analysis, and not all analyses lead to supporting an amendment in a designated use. But for those work plans that do demonstrate their support to conduct an analysis, either a use attainability analysis or an existing use analysis is then completed. I'll tell you the difference between the two. The use attainability analysis is conducted if there's evidence that a water is overprotected. This analysis is a three-step process, which requires demonstration that the existing use will be protected, as we discussed in the anti-DEG policy, establishment of the factor preventing the attainment of the current designated use, and then we have to demonstrate what the highest attainable use would be. Since, according to 40 CFR 131.10I, a designated use is not permitted to be less stringent than an existing use, the existing use analysis is conducted if there's water quality data demonstrating a water body is underprotected. And in general, it really only requires the evidence establishing the existing use. Now, since designated uses are codified under 20.6.4 NMAC, amendments, whether they're more stringent or less stringent, have to undergo that rulemaking process. But amendments to designated uses, unlike what we saw with the anti-degradation policy, aren't limited to being brought forth during a triennial review or by the department. Rather, these amendments routinely undergo the rulemaking process independently at any time by the department or by outside entities as deemed appropriate by the commission. So now that we've determined an appropriate use for a water body that upholds the objectives of the Clean Water Act, we need to establish the water pollutants that, if exceeded, would prevent that particular use. So for each designated use, there are a series of criteria that have been established. The state has two types of criteria, numeric and narrative. The numeric criteria are specific constituents to which, if a defined concentration were to be exceeded, the use wouldn't be supported. And to give you an example, if a water body had an arsenic concentration of 340 micrograms per liter, aquatic life couldn't survive. So how do we determine these criteria? Well, numeric criteria must be derived from scientific toxicological studies. And EPA plays a significant role in doing the heavy lifting on deriving these limits. So in many cases, they are the entity that culminates these studies and derives guidance for the numeric criteria, and they do this as part of Section 304A of the Clean Water Act. The federal regulations actually require states to adopt these criteria unless the state can demonstrate through scientific evidence that another criteria is more appropriate. The second type of criteria are narrative criteria. Now, these criteria apply to all waters of the state, and they do not have specified limits. These used to be referred to as free-from, so you might have heard that in the past. And that's really meaning that if possible, through enforceable actions, these constituents should not be discharged to a surface water. And these include things like suspended solids, fats, oils, greases, organoleptic, plant nutrients, pathogens, temperature. However, in addition to the free-forms, there's also narrative criteria for biological integrity. Now, unlike what we saw with designated uses, adopting or amending criteria has a different process and generally requires a higher scientific rigor to demonstrate the toxicological effects as it pertains to a particular use. So, as such, we generally only amend the criteria during a triennial review. So how do water quality standards fit into the bigger picture of water quality protection? And how does the triennial review serve as a vital component of that process? So as water quality standards are developed, the agency conducts water quality monitoring and then assesses the quality against the applicable standards. At this point, there may be indications that a water quality standard is not appropriate for a particular water body. And then an analysis is conducted to determine if the water quality standard warrants amendment. Once the waters are assessed, the department prepares a list of waters that are not meeting the established water quality standards. Now, this is often referred to as the 303D list, and that's really based on the section of the Clean Water Act to which the listings required by states to be created. When waters are listed as impaired, there can be information indicating that the water quality standard that's been established isn't attainable based on one of 6 defined criteria under the federal regulations. On the other spectrum, if the listing demonstrates that the waters always attain to a higher stringency than the designated use, this gives us information that the designated use may not be stringent enough. So it's at either of these points that we would launch an analysis of the standard and determine if an amendment is warranted. From the impaired waters list, total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs for short, are established. These limits are then used in developing limits in the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits and in developing watershed-based plans to minimize non-point source contributions. Throughout every one of these processes, the public is provided opportunity to participate and engage. As it pertains to the state's triennial review, the public's involvement helps ensure the state's water quality standards are appropriate, which enhances the functionality in protecting and restoring the state's waters as established in the objectives of the Clean Water Act. So now that we've outlined some of the regulatory drivers for the development and amendment of water quality standards, I'd like to transition over to the amendments that we're proposing for the 2020 triennial review. So in order to determine what revisions were necessary, the department began to review the requirements under 40 CFR 131.20 and 20.6.4.10a NMAC. As I mentioned earlier, the federal language requires states to review designated uses, the anti-degradation policy, temporary standards, as well as other implementation policies in the standards. The department's worked with Bureau staff in noting areas within the standards that warranted closer evaluation since the last triennial review. Now, these potential revisions range from typographical corrections to expanding explanations on certain processes used to uphold the water quality standards. NMAD conducted an evaluation of those needs and assigned a ranking system to assist with prioritization of potential revisions. The ranking was based on regulatory drivers and direct impacts to the implementation of the standards. So we have 4 tiers. Tier 1 are those amendments that the state is required to review, such as the numeric criteria in EPA's 304A guidance. Tier 2 are those amendments that, although not required to be reviewed under a triennial, would pose implications for implementing water quality standards if they weren't amended. Tier 3 are those amendments that, similar to Tier 2, can only be amended during a triennial, but would not pose implications if not made at this time. These are more formatting or preferential wording that, although beneficial, don't change implementation. And then there's Tier 4, and those are amendments that have the liberty to be brought forth outside of a triennial review. And these include ONRW nominations and use attainability analyses. So the department ended up determining that revisions being brought forth during this particular triennial were going to be limited to those actions that were classified as either Tier 1 or Tier 2. Those that are Tier 3 or Tier 4 are not being brought forth at this time because they can either be brought forth outside the triennial review or not of consequence to implementing water quality standards. For each of those that were identified as being Tier 1 or Tier 2, an in-depth analysis of the information needed to support the amendment, along with the history of that section, was conducted to ensure adequate evidence was available to proceed. So this has led us to a working list of potential amendments for the 2020 triennial review that we're here to discuss with you today. So as we just discussed, the state's initial review of needs created a working list of potential amendments. There's 6 general areas that the department is proposing language for, and we'll be discussing each of these in more detail. First, the state is proposing adding new language to the objectives of the state's water quality standards. Second, and as you can probably expect in any triennial review, there's always a need to update definitions. The third area of focus is clarifying language throughout 20.6.4 NMAC. fourth are the amendments clarifying existing regulatory processes. This is predominantly under the review of standards in section 10 and the use attainability analysis in section 15. Then the department is also evaluating a few designated use amendments, which I'll discuss here in more detail in a minute. And then finally, as some of you may know, EPA updated a considerable number of aquatic life and human health criteria under Section 304A of the Clean Water Act. And as a result, there have been several proposed amendments to the state's numeric criteria. So like I said, we'll be going through each of these areas in a bit more detail, but for reference, the proposed amendments being considered are available on the Bureau's webpage. So the first amendment of considerable note is the new objective for the state's water quality standards. As some of you may know, in 2019, Governor Lujan Grisham signed Executive Order 2019-003 on addressing climate change and energy waste prevention. EO 2019-003 directs all state agencies to evaluate the impacts of climate change on their programs and operations and integrate climate change mitigation and adaptation practices. Although the objective of the Clean Water Act and its regulations, particularly those that are associated with the anti-degradation policy, inherently carry the intent of resiliency to climate change, it's vital to clearly call out the global and existential threat to our state's waters. So these photos are examples of how climate change impacts water quality and the work that's still needed to overcome it. So as part of this directive, and to ensure water quality protections address the challenges posed by climate change, a new subsection was incorporated into section 20.6.4.6 NMAC. The intent is to acknowledge that one of the objectives of the state's water quality standards is to address the threats posed to water quality by climate change. So as part of this triennial review, there's also been several updates to the definitions section, as you can see in this table here. These are just some of these are just amendments to the existing definitions, and that's to enhance clarity or provide consistency in implementation, while some of them are new, and those are also with the intent to add clarity and implementation of the standards. There are two of the new definitions that you see here are actually being migrated from another section of NMAC, and that's just to add in consistency and aid in referencing, and that's the harmonic mean flow and unclassified waters of the state, and I'll talk about those in a second. So there are a series of general amendments that are being proposed, none of which add or remove existing applicability, but rather aid in implementation. And these amendments include the anti-degradation policy and implementation plan under Section 8, some amendments in the outstanding national resource waters section, and we're really just updating the procedural reference to reflect the adoption of the new objective, which includes climate change. The applicability of water quality standards under Section 11, and that's to move the definition for harmonic mean flow and unclassified waters of the state to the definition section. The compliance with water quality standards under Section 12, where the department's proposing to amend language to clarify that compliance schedules are allowed in NPDES permits on a case-by-case basis. The general criteria under Section 13 is adding language to include contaminants of emerging concern and specifically identifying those toxic pollutants identified in the state's surface and groundwater regulations under 20.6.2 NMAC. Amending language in several sections is listed here for classified waters to clarify that their applicability is to the perennial reaches of tributaries too. There's some minor amendments to languages and to language in sections 311, 312, 405, and 408, and those are being proposed for consistency purposes. And although there are several significant amendments being proposed under Section 900, which we'll discuss in more detail in a few minutes, there are a few minor amendments as well. And these include clarifying language for marginal warm water criteria, and that's to be consistent with the definition we see in section 7. Correcting the select acute and chronic hardness base metals values that were miscalculated in the reference tables. Adding clarification that the designated use for irrigation also includes irrigation storage. Clarifying the language used for abbreviations, and as can always be expected, the department's proposing to amend references to be consistent with the most current versions of these documents. So beyond the general amendments being proposed during this triennial, there are a few sections of NMAC that the department is proposing more significant amendments to. The first section that I'd like to discuss are those amendments in the review of standards need for additional study section under 20.6.4.10 NMAC. So as shown here on the slide, and as you can find on the Surface Water Quality Bureau's webpage, these amendments highlighted in red are intended to add clarity in implementing a water quality standards amendment. And we're proposing to do this by adding a new subsection, as you can see here in B, and then amending subsection C. This language is intended to clarify the required process for amending a designated use where the existing use is more stringent. This language also adds consistency with the federal language found under 40 CFR 131.10I. So as we'll discuss on the next slide, language is also being proposed to tie in these requirements with the requirements for amending a designated use to be less stringent. So once we establish a review of standards includes amending designated uses based on the existing uses, the other section of NMAC that warranted more clarity in language is the use attainability analysis under section 15. And for the sake of readability, I didn't include the proposed language here, but like I said, you can find it on our webpage. In summary though, clarification of language here really focused on incorporating headings to provide clarity on the application of each subsection, adding language to clarify that the hydrology protocol is an acceptable method for identifying perennial waters, adding a subsection to describe the process for determining the highest attainable use, and that's really to provide consistency with the federal regulations, adding a new subsection to provide clarity and consistency with the process for removing and replacing a designated use using the required elements for an expedited process, using the department's hydrology protocol. And then finally, amending language to provide consistency with the water quality management plan, continuing planning process, and clarity regarding the process for a use attainability analysis being conducted by an entity other than the department. And like I said, these amendments, as they're being proposed, can be found on our website. Now, there are two amendments to designated uses based on existing uses that we're proposing. As we touched on a while ago, an existing use is a use that's been attained at some point after November 28, 1975. So in order to amend a designated use based on an existing use, demonstration must be made that the water was able to attain the water quality necessary for that use, and the water is supporting that use. The first existing use analysis is evaluating several tributaries that currently have secondary contact recreational use. There's evidence of demonstrating at least some of these waters have an existing use supporting primary contact. And as some of you may remember, a similar amendment was taken before the Commission during the last triennial review. However, the Commission determined there wasn't sufficient evidence to demonstrate the water quality supported the use. So since that time, the department has developed a comprehensive existing use analysis to provide the evidence needed to amend the designated recreational uses for some of these tributaries. The other designated use amendment being proposed comes out of a joint stipulation between the department, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and Amigos Bravos, which was entered into as part of the last triennial review. The department's proposing to amend designated uses and add a new section, 20.6.4.140 NMAC, for intermittent portions of waters within Los Alamos National Laboratory, as demonstrated through an existing use analysis. So as part of this, the waters classified in section 128 are being proposed to only include identified ephemeral waters or ephemeral portions of waters within lands managed by the United States Department of Energy within Los Alamos National Labs. As a natural outcome of the work conducted under this joint stipulation, the department's also preparing an existing use analysis, which should provide supporting evidence needed to propose adding several other named perennial waters to section 126. Work on both of these existing use analyses are still in the process of being completed, though. So finally, the largest area that underwent amendments was the criteria applicable to existing designated or attainable uses under section 900. There's several major amendments being considered in this section. The first is the incorporation of numeric primary contact criteria for microcystins and cylindropermopsin. Now, these are constituents that are associated with harmful algal blooms, and the limits being proposed for the state's water quality standards are consistent with those promulgated by EPA under Section 304 of the Federal Clean Water Act. Additionally, the department is clarifying language for aluminum criteria. This includes adding language clarifying the pH range to which the acute and chronic life hardness-based criteria apply. That would then reestablish the acute and chronic aquatic life criteria for dissolved aluminum that is outside of that acceptable range for the hardness-based criteria. And as a result of that, there's an amendment to remove the language regarding EPA's disapproval of the hardness-based equations for aluminum. So as many of you may know, EPA recently issued a new aluminum criteria to which the department reviewed as part of the triennial review. However, after review, the department has determined that the current hardness-based criteria would not be replaced with EPA's multilinear regression-based criteria. In addition to the proposed amendments for aluminum, EPA undertook a major update to numerous water quality criteria in 2015. And as a result, there are amendments proposed for over 94 numeric criteria during this triennial review. Both those criteria associated with human health, organism only, and those associated with acute and chronic aquatic life. Now, these pollutants are being updated to comply with 40 CFR 131.20, which requires the state to adopt criteria established under Section 304A of the Clean Water Act, or derive alternative criteria that are demonstrated to be protective of the use. As part of the aquatic life use criteria updates, EPA also recently updated the acute and chronic aquatic life ammonia criteria. So amendments proposed in subsections K, L, and M reflect those updates. As part of the triennial review, as it pertains to criteria, the department also identified several criteria that were listed under Section 304A of the Clean Water Act, but not incorporated into the state's water quality standards. So the department's proposing to add these criteria for acute and chronic aquatic life pollutants in order to comply with 40 CFR 131.20. So now that we've given some background on the regulatory framework and the amendments under consideration, we want to talk briefly about the administrative process and the tentative timelines for that process. So this slide gives a breakdown of the three primary components in the rulemaking process. The first of these is outreach. The department's bound by both federal and state regulations that prescribe what outreach should include. In part, the department conducts tribal outreach, stakeholder outreach, and then general public outreach. These outreach activities occur at several key steps in the process. That's to ensure that adequate opportunity for meaningful engagement has occurred. For this triennial review, the state has reached out to both tribes and stakeholders and is now reaching out to you, the public, for comment on our proposed amendments. In tandem with outreach, the department must develop the amendments and prepare the supporting documentation for those amendments. Following the input we received from our tribal and stakeholder outreach efforts, the department's prepared a public comment draft for review. The comments that we receive from the public will then be considered in preparation with filing with the Water Quality Control Commission. And finally, and also conducted interspersed within outreach and amendment development, we have the legal and administrative tasks that must be conducted for any rulemaking before the Water Quality Control Commission. And this list identifies some of the major milestones that must be attended to for any amendment to the state's water quality standards. So these three elements make up the process that is undertaken for a triennial review. Now, this table provides a more concise breakdown of the steps for the rulemaking process. Starting with outreach, which is done in accordance with the state's approved water quality management plan and continuing planning process. So as you see here, the department's already petitioned the Water Quality Control Commission for a hearing date, which has been set for July 13th through 16th, 2021. And as circled here on the second row, the proposed amendments have been sent out for public comment. The next steps include providing hearing notice, and this is anticipated to be published approximately 60 days prior to the deadline to submit the notice of intent to present technical testimony, in order to provide opportunities for tribes, stakeholders, and members of the public to participate should they choose to do so. Keep in mind that there's additional opportunity for the public to provide comment during the hearing itself, even if they did not submit a notice of intent to present technical testimony. So after the hearing, the Water Quality Control Commission will deliberate and render an order. This will then be drafted as a final order and a statement of reasons for each one of the amendments that are being proposed. The approved amendments will then be codified and ruled once it's published in the state register. And then it's at this point that the amendments become effective for state purposes. Once they're made effective for state purposes, NMAC then submits the adopted rule to EPA Region 6 for review. Now, EPA has 60 days to approve the proposed standards and then or 90 days to disapprove. However, it should be noted that it is the practice of the department to engage EPA Region 6 early and often so that we don't run into delays at this point of the review. So once EPA approves the rule, it's then effective for purposes of the Clean Water Act, and notification to all parties is made. Due to the numerous regulatory requirements for each of these steps, this process, although lengthy, really provides numerous opportunities for public participation. So as we stand with the current triennial review process, we can see here in this slide a general timeline of the major steps that must be completed. The activities on the top row illustrate those tasks involving tribes, stakeholders, and the public, while the bottom row depicts internal work being conducted by NMAC. And for quick reference, the arrows in green or gray, depending on your screen, are what's already been completed to date. So as you've seen, the administrative process for rulemaking is lengthy, and it has uncertainties that are beyond the department or even the commission's control. So in order to comply with the federal regulations regarding the frequency of triennial reviews, NMAC initiates the hearing process at least once every 3 years from the date of EPA's approval of the last triennial review. Since the last triennial was approved by EPA in August 2017, we've initiated the administrative process to meet that triennial review timeline. So as you can see, we've undertaken several key steps to get where we are today. Starting with the bottom row, NMAC began working on needs for amendments back in the late spring, early summer 2019. Once the needs were identified, that prioritization phase we just discussed earlier took place between around July and October of 2019. Then from about September 2019 to May 2020, NMAC was gathering and preparing evidence that would be needed for the proposed amendments that we identified. At the same time, as you can see on the top row, between May 2019 and December 2019, there had been ongoing dialogue with interested parties. Then in January of 2020, tribal outreach efforts were initiated. And then once there was some discussion points on the potential amendments, NMAC began stakeholder outreach in July of 2020. So in order to keep up with the essence of the Triennial Review's 3-year cycle, the department drafted proposed changes and petitioned the WQCC for a hearing date in August of 2020. The Commission heard the department's petition in October and granted a hearing date for July 13th through 16th, 2021. So at this point, NMED is working with members of the public and gathering comments on the proposed changes in order to begin preparation for the hearing. So as we discussed in the previous slide, if the hearing and deliberations proceed without incident, the department could, in theory, publish the amended rule and submit to EPA probably around the spring of 2022, and that would give us a potential approval date somewhere around summer of 2022. So now that we've presented information on what the water quality standards are, what the department's proposing to amend, and the tentative timeline, I do want to take the time to thank everybody again for participating today. We do want to hear what your comments are, if you have questions regarding the proposed amendments. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Chris, and he can begin our listening session. Chris? Let's see if Chris is still there.
Sorry about that. I had lost my mute button there for a minute.
That is fine.
Okay, let me share my screen here. Okay, next on our agenda, we have our question and answer and listening session. Just a few ground rules to keep things organized. You may raise your hand if you wish to speak by hovering over your name in the participant window and right-clicking, and you should see a raise hand icon, or indicate you have a comment or question in your chat window, or you can type the chat or your question in the chat window. And when called on, please provide a statement or your question, and we are looking for input on the areas that we have proposed today, or questions about the material. We'd like everybody to have a chance to speak, so keep things brief, and we will make sure to get back to you if you have additional follow-up questions. So let me open up the participant window here and see if we have any hands raised. And I'll also look in the chat for any questions there. Okay, we do have one question in the chat from Natalie Love. Is there any chance the current comment deadline will be extended?
Thank you, Natalie, for the question. I think that we may actually have a request for an extension, and the department's considering that request. And as soon as that decision is made, if there is an extension, we will put out a notice that it's been extended.
Okay, there's another question in the chat from Brian Dale. Regarding the tiered approach to considering triennial review proposals, I am interested in a reiteration of what qualifies for each of the tiers and where this approach is codified.
Thanks, Brian. To answer your question about the tiered approach, it is not codified. The department is required under the triennial review to evaluate certain elements of the water quality standards. And we wanted to make sure that we met those federal requirements first and foremost. Secondly, we always want to make sure that we're addressing any amendments that could have implications on, have issues with implementing water quality standards. So those were really the first two priorities, and then whatever resources allowed were for those third and fourth tiers. Does that help?
And he says, understood. Here's
Great.
another question from Dahl. I have a question regarding the hearing process. Past procedural orders have allowed for other parties to propose changes to the standards outside the scope of the SWQB's proposals. I do not see this in the current procedural order. What is the SWQB's intention regarding whether and how parties other than NMAC might propose amendments?
I think I will hand that one off to our legal counsel, John Verheul, because I think he can answer that more succinctly than I could.
Hi, Dal. Thank you for the question. For everyone listening, this is John Verheul. In the prior triennial review, I can't speak for triennial reviews earlier than 2015, but we attempted to limit the scope of the rulemaking process to NMAC's amendments and any proposed changes from other parties that were logical outgrowths of NMAC's proposed amendments. And we asked the same from the hearing officer this time, and there is language to that effect in the procedural order, but I think there's always some wiggle room as to what qualifies as a logical outgrowth. That's number one. Number two, it is always possible for another party to petition the WQCC for rulemaking and ask that proposed changes be done as part of the triennial review hearing process. And then if the commission wishes, or if the hearing officer wishes, those matters can be consolidated into the triennial review, or the commission or the hearing officer would have the authority to say, no, this should be a separate hearing process outside of the triennial review. So I think those are the different options for other parties other than NMAC proposing changes to 20.6.4 NMAC. And I think the route to take depends really on what the substance is of those changes. Clearly, if it's something directly related to an amendment that the department has already proposed, then perhaps that can be done simply through the NOI process or via comment. And the department's always, willing to discuss with individual stakeholders if they have particular concerns or additional changes that they think are appropriate that are directly related to changes that we've made. I hope that answers the question. Great.
Thank you, John. Dahl. Here we have another question in the chat from Max Hinkles. Can you explain the significance of the added definition for unclassified waters of the state? What is the intended effect of this definition?
Max, this is Jennifer. Actually, we are not adding new language. We are merely moving language from where this definition currently resides into the definition sections. So there has always been a definition for unclassified waters of the state, and those are waters that are not specifically identified in sections 101 through 899. And it really pertains to those ephemeral, intermittent, and perennial waters in sections 97, 98, and 99. But the definition was embedded, I think it was in section 10. I want to say it's in section 10. And so we're just pulling it out of that section and putting it where you can actually find it under the definitions. Does that help?
Okay, great question. Thank you, Max. So I don't see any hands raised or any other questions. Would anybody like to unmute, and we'll open the floor up to any questions? Okay, we have another question from Brian Dale. Regarding changes to 20.6.4.126, 128, and 140, will there be more traditional segment descriptions other than portions of using geographic limits, or is this a work in progress?
I'm going to take the easy answer for this one. No. At this point, it really is a work in progress. For 126, they have always been described waters, and therefore, so section 126 for everybody else attending, section 126 are those perennial waters as listed that are within Los Alamos National Laboratory. And through our hydrology protocol surveys, we did identify a couple of water bodies that had been classified or showed up as being perennial. So we would specifically identify them under section 126, just as all the other water bodies in 126 are described. For section 128, those currently just read ephemeral and intermittent waters, and there's no boundaries as to what those waters are. They're not specifically called out. The way that the proposed language, what we're proposing right now, which is still subject to being finalized, we're not finished with the existing use analysis on that, so there is room for change. But as we would see it being proposed, is it would list specific ephemeral waters, and then section 140 would be the more generalized intermittent waters, but not specifically called out, so that every water within Los Alamos National Laboratory would actually fall under 126, 127, 128, or 140. Does that answer your question or clarify it?
He says somewhat, yes.
As I said, it is still somewhat of a work in progress, but we wanted to propose what we were thinking of, and then once we have the demonstration, it will be more solidified.
Well, we do have about another hour scheduled for questions, so please feel free to bring them up. We are here for you. Okay, another question in the chat from James Biarzi. When will this demonstration be done? Before the commission hears the proposal?
Hi, James. Yes, it would be done before the commission hears the proposal. It would be submitted as one of our exhibits when we submit our notice of intent to present technical testimony. So there will be opportunity for review and for people to submit technical testimony on it as well.
And I would just add, to clarify that, or to add a little bit more detail to that, on the current procedural order, notices of intent to present technical testimony are due, I think, some 3 months or more ahead of the public hearing.
Thank you for that clarification. And there is a follow-up statement from Mr. Biarzi. Thank you. It's difficult to comment on this section without the analysis being completed.
Noted. And we are working on getting that analysis completed. But we did not want to prolong it longer than needed and potentially miss the triennial review. So that's why it is in the proposed language. It is acknowledged that without the actual existing use analysis, it's difficult to comment on. And that could be a comment that should be submitted to us.
This is partially in response to Mr. Biarzi's recent comment. Just kind of a reminder for everybody, the purpose of this listening session is to present NMED's proposed amendments to 20.6.4 to the standards and to hear feedback from members of the public, stakeholders, and this might also help provide clarification for written comments that you want to submit. But I know that both Chris and Jen mentioned this before, but I wanted to reiterate, this is just a session that the department is doing for outreach and to get feedback in a different format than via an official public comment period that's associated with the rulemaking. There is still certainly, and I know, James, that you'll probably be affiliated with a party that enters an appearance and participates in the triennial review, but there is still certainly time for any person or any other parties to submit comments during the rulemaking process itself, and those comments would actually be submitted to the hearing administrator rather than directly to the department. So there should be time.
Thank you. So a statement from Jody Ahrens. Given the current stay-at-home order, it is essential for NED to provide an extension of time. People are dealing with other issues right now. Please grant at least a 2-week extension of time to begin when the stay-at-home order is lifted. Thank you for your consideration of our request. So, Jen, how would somebody formally request an extension of the comment?
John, do you want to take this one?
I certainly can. Any formal request for extension of the comment period should be done in writing, and it should be done in the same manner that you would submit a comment, which would be via email to Jennifer Fulham, and her contact information is on the notice of this comment period. I would also add we have received one request for extension already that we are considering. That request, I think, takes us into very early January, and that request is still under consideration. But the best way to request an extension is via email to Jen Fulham.
Thank you for that information and clarification, John. So I'll ask a question. So what would be the next step in which somebody could participate in this process?
There are a couple of areas in which people can participate. I strongly encourage, first of all, If you have comments, questions, want to engage, feel free to get a hold of me, submit your comments. Like John said, email me your comments, and we do read them and we do take them under consideration. That is the first one. The second one is probably going to be the notice of intent to present technical testimony. Those submissions, and that's to the commission, that's saying that you want to testify for or against, or have a technical testimony to be brought forth during the hearing. And that, I believe, those submittals as the procedural order that I've seen is in April, beginning of early April. And so that would be the next opportunity. And then during a hearing, which some of you may have participated in the past, and even if you haven't, the hearing officer generally, at least once a day, I've seen twice a day usually around before lunch or after lunch, and then towards the end, you're allowed to present your comments to the commission. You don't have to necessarily file. You file if you want to testify, but you can attend the hearing and provide comment as you see appropriate. And we do look forward to it. The commission does take those comments under strong consideration, and it makes for a better water quality standards process. So those are the next couple of steps that people can participate on if they choose to do so.
Thank you. Of course, I knew the answer to that. I was just fishing for information for everybody else.
And it's good to reiterate, there are several steps in all our rulemaking processes, and that you can participate at whatever level you feel appropriate or you feel important. And just because you miss one doesn't mean that you are not allowed to participate as it progresses. So always feel more than welcome to be a part of the process. It is a public hearing, and that's why we want the public to be involved.
So we have another question from Brian Dale. Regarding the Pajarito-Llano EUA, there are data available to N3B Triad that fit the criteria that make this avenue rather than the UAA appealing. Can you guide us to successful examples of this tool?
Regarding the Llano EUA, data available to fit the criteria to make this avenue. So I'm trying to understand your question, Brian. We're looking at doing an existing use analysis, which looks at the highest quality of water that a water body has attained since any time after 1975, because the states are required to amend a designated use to be no less stringent than an existing use. And as it is right now, ephemeral and intermittent waters have a limited aquatic life use. If there's data that demonstrates that these water bodies at any time have been able to attain a higher aquatic life use under the 131.10I, 40 CFR 131.10I, we would be obligated to amend that designated use to be at least as stringent as that existing use. So I'm not sure about rather than the UAA. Maybe you can give me more information on what you're trying to get at.
Well, I would also add that the term existing use analysis, EUA, was something that we developed pretty recently to explain the difference between a use attainability analysis and looking at existing uses. Correct. So for us, we don't really have any specific examples where we have been successful at this before, since this is really a kind of a new and different approach for us, but one that we feel is the correct approach and gives the public and the commission both the needed information they can use to make a decision.
Okay, so you're saying, Brian is saying that on EPA's UAA page, a successful example they provide is like your criteria, a UAA to change from secondary to primary. A use attainability analysis under the federal regulations is required for when you're changing a designated use to be less stringent, not more stringent. Matter of fact, the federal regulations don't say you need anything in particular to change a designated use to be more stringent, because we're required to not have it be less stringent than an existing use. So we don't, the use attainability analysis is very particular to making a designated use amendment to be less stringent, because you have to demonstrate it's not going to be lower than the existing use, that it meets one of the 6 criteria under the federal regulations to remove that use. It's actually a remove and replace action. So you have to demonstrate that one of the 6 criteria EPA allows for has been demonstrated. And then you have to do an analysis to determine what the highest attainable use then would be. Existing use analysis under the federal regs don't require any of that. They just require us to show what the existing use is, and then we need to change the designated use to at least meet that. The reason we have coined the term existing use analysis is predominantly because the commission needs something, and they are very familiar with the UAA process, but not all the things that are in a UAA are required or warranted to change it, to change a designated use to be more stringent. So we have similarities between the 2 analyses. However, the existing use analysis really does not require all the same rigor and elements that a use attainability analysis is. Existing use analysis, as Chris said, is a term that we have recently coined to assist the public and the commission and us internally on developing an efficient process in which we check all these. We have a consistent process on how we evaluate it, and then it allows the commission to be familiar with what we're presenting to them. So you will not find existing use analysis under the federal regulations. You will find under 40 CFR 131.10I that we are required to change a designated use if it's less stringent than an existing use. And that's what the requirement is. We call it an existing use analysis. I hope that clarified it. Okay.
So if you do have questions or statements, please unmute and let us know. Yeah, I think we're close to wrapping up. We'll give it another minute or so for anybody that's composing their thoughts. Brian types in the chat, thanks for answering our questions, much appreciated. You're definitely welcome.
No problem, you're welcome.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to any written comments or emailed comments that you would like to provide. If you do want to send Jennifer an email, it is on the webpage for the public notice. We will be posting this presentation on our website if you want to review again or know anybody else that was not able to attend this meeting. And again, thank you.
Yes, thank you, everybody.